It's wonderful to see such a great crowd here today. So welcome to Design, Sealed, and Delivered. I'm Heather McCue. I am a longtime fixture in the community with all certifications from 7 forward. I proposed this session because while working on my UX certification a couple years back at SMU, I realized that although the philosophy and processes behind UX design were totally applicable to what we do as FileMaker developers, there was an underrepresentation in all of the examples that were being shown in the classes I was taking. They were all web and apps, mobile apps and websites. And a lot of what we do looks just as good, if not sometimes better, than some of the websites I've seen for sure. But the process of actually building a product, building a software product, was not used as an example. And as a FileMaker-centric developer for 3.5 decades, I was offended a little bit. So I recognized a distinct lack of representation for custom software development, and I thought others might be interested in what I had learned. And so I have given variations on this presentation. This will be my 5th. The last one was FM Disk a year ago, January. I also gave this presentation with no computer at Pause on Error a couple years back. Did the whole thing with a flip pad because the year before power went out. So I wanted to be totally prepared, right? So all old school. So I'm real excited today though, because joining me is my coworker and colleague, John Mazzaro, who is our UX engineer at Harmonic. So I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jean Mazzaro. I'm a UX engineer at Harmonic. I have over 6 years experience in UX design, and also have over a decade experience in back and forth web and software development and design roles. So I have worked in various projects for various industries. I have worked for government agencies, platforms, career services for universities and colleges. I've also worked for e-commerce companies optimizing both B2B and B2C shopper experience. English is not my first language, as you can tell by the accent. I'm originally from Rwanda. I was born there and grew up there. Then I moved here in Texas about 9 years ago. So the funny accent that you hear is a mixture of all that. So if I say anything in a funny way or you're not able to hear what I'm saying, feel free to let me know. I won't be offended. I'm happy to repeat it. And I want to thank everyone for being here. I know that there are a lot of awesome sessions going on right now, but I also want to assure you that you made the right choice. So some of what we will discuss will probably sound familiar, and that's because our intention is to encourage everyone to look at the things that they are doing right, and also try to find some opportunities on things where they can improve their processes. So what really makes UX processes a delight for software developers is gives them a better way of doing their job, right? So it gives them a informed way of making the right choices in the process. And it's a matter of having a methodology versus just winging it. So to get started...
We've never winged it, have we? Once or twice?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Heather is going to tell you a little bit about how UX plays an essential role in what we do at Harmonic, and we'll go from there.
So customers come to us for solutions to their problems, which requires us to be masters in the art of discerning the real problem. Have any of you ever had the experience where the client comes to you and says, I want A, you build A, and then it turns out they need Z? Yep. Yeah, never happens. Okay, so UX enhances our insights and improves our ability to discern the real issues and the real needs of our customers. We do that by incorporating user feedback, and that gives us a competitive advantage. UX helps us to manage expectations, as Sean mentioned, by clarifying objectives, prioritizing the user needs, transparent communication as part of the whole process, delivering value incrementally, which I'll show you in a cool graphic later, and managing change efficiently. So by prioritizing user-centric design principles, and incorporating user feedback throughout the design lifecycle, we're creating more transparency with our customers so that they can unlock significant value and competitive advantages. More specifically, I wanted to share the process and the teams that we have at Harmonic. So we have 5 different teams: business practices, low code, D&D, which is design and documentation, and app tech, and then managed services. So our processes involve all teams. Basically, an opportunity comes into the company and is evaluated by business practices. That turns into a design phase. And I want to emphasize that all projects start with a design phase. And yes, we charge the customer for the design phase up front. That's a fixed cost based on what we know going in. We start with the design phase. The result and the deliverable of that design phase is a project plan for building what they agree that they want and need. So that turns into the design phase, which is handled by our D&D or design and development team, as I said. And that leads to an execution or development phase that's executed by our low code and app tech teams. Naturally, that turns into a need for documentation, training, onboarding, etc. So that comes back to D&D. And those users, they're going to need support from managed services, and that business inevitably develops into more business. That's the idea. Keep them happy, they come back. They want more. So, to synopsize what we're going to talk about today, we're going to cover UX fundamentals. Now, there are other UX related sessions being delivered here at Engage. So we've made a conscious effort to limit our coverage of some of the fundamentals so that we can focus on interactions with your customer when following the design thinking process. That said, we are going to cover some fundamentals because they're pretty critical and you might not be attending some of those sessions. So, but I highly recommend them if you haven't. I haven't heard yet. I don't have the time, so I'm sorry for that. But there is UX 101 and user stories, which are also real important in defining your problems. We're also going to talk about securing customer approval. We'll discuss how and when to involve your customer throughout the process. And we'll discuss successful delivery. So the goal here is not just to make things work or to make things work via the shortest or cheapest path, because none of us have ever had to do that either, but to make things work for the user. Because in the end, it's the user being happy that matters. And the user is not always the customer that's coming to you, telling you what they need. But if the user isn't happy, the customer's not going to be happy in the end. Because, I mean, I've seen systems where everybody thought they were great, but the user never saw it until it was delivered. The user hated it, refused to use it. So, in a company with only 4 people, they can do that. Anyway, so that's what we'll be covering. And in order to get the customer's buy-in, there are certain concepts and fundamentals that you'll need to understand. These are what I like to call the design part of our conversation. And the first fundamental that we're going to cover is the 5-step iterative design, the 5-step iterative design thinking process. I say iterative so often, but it's one of those words you can trip on easily. Okay, so step 1, often referred to as the empathy step, is where you'll do your research and learn about the users and their needs. This is best accomplished by interviewing and speaking with the actual end users when possible. We have one client that runs a cotton gin, actually multiple cotton gins around the country. We actually flew out there, visited the gin, talked to the plant manager, talk to the people in the office who are dealing with the trucks coming in that have to be weighed, so that we really understood the processes and the workflows that they're using, that what they're used to, what they really need, where the deficits exist. And you don't get that by talking to the president of the company. So empathizing with the users enables you to better define the problem so that you can plan, which is step 2. Next, we ideate or design. Fun part, right? So note though, while it's not shown here, with each step, the design thinking process includes communication and feedback loops with the customer. Sometimes with the customer, president, whoever that you're interfacing with, and sometimes with the end user, depending on what stage you're at. This ensures that everyone's on the same page as the project proceeds, which of course we all know is essential, because we know what happens when we're not on the same page, right? No one's ever had that happen either. So after ideation comes prototyping, which will undoubtedly spark new ideas. And finally, we test. And here, I'm not talking about the expected internal code review, making sure that it works the way you think it should work. Here, I'm talking about usability testing, right? By end users. And go ahead, say something.
So when you test it and it works on your computer, that's not enough.
No, it's not enough. Because sometimes they do it on a Tuesday while standing on their head and everything breaks, right? In fact, as soon as I get out of this presentation, I have a client in New York that I have to call to figure out why what works for me doesn't work for them. So, all right, so this will inevitably spark new ideas for the project, which brings you back to an earlier part of the process. It'll teach you more about the users and their needs and reveal insights that redefine the problem. Now, it's easy to imagine that an iterative process looks something like this, with your existing intake, communication, development, sharing, and training, leading to some sort of what we might think of as a meeting of the minds, that it's kind of a circular back and forth. It's been our experience, however, that the design thinking process looks a little bit more like this. Where we begin, oh, come on, seriously, draw. Oh, here we go. One more click, sorry. Looks a bit more like this, where we begin with research and based on our finding, we begin to plan and ideate. Wow. So sorry. There we go. Research, plan, ideate, and then these findings are factored into our planning and our ideation continues. And go. Our ideas, we require a little more input from the end users to clarify details or confirm assumptions that we've reached, because sometimes we're not right either. Right? They're not always the ones that are wrong. So these findings get factored into our planning and our ideation continues with our planning. And then our ideas result in wireframes. Show up here in a second. Ideas, wireframes. And feedback fuels more ideation, just followed by some low fidelity prototyping. We'll show what that is a little bit later. And then testing, followed by some high fidelity prototyping and more testing to validate. And then more validation testing and prototyping and more testing until finally we have something that actually works and that meets the needs. So the sequence looks a little bit more like this instead of that straight line. So as you can see, the iterative design thinking process is less of a fixed sequence of events and more of a series of overlapping phases on a framework that translates the user needs into products, services, and experiences. And I apologize that that circly thing in the background is not disappearing like it should. It will at some point. There we go. That's what happens when you tweak your slides an hour before the presentation. Okay. See, I had the whole thing automated, so it all just ran, but I wasn't sure it was going to give me time to talk. So I separated it into clicks, and I guess I did it wrong. Anyway, apologies for that. So it's a highly collaborative approach that yields better outcome, more innovative solutions through what we refer to as empathetic research or ethnographic studies even. How many of you know what an ethnographic study is? You do. My mother's an anthropologist, and I cannot tell you how excited she was when I called her and asked her to describe ethnographic studies to me. I got a 20-minute lecture about visiting tribes, and so I thought, yeah, when I go to a client's office and I sit behind someone at the desk and watch them, it's like I'm watching a tribe somewhere. You know? You do it that way? What's that other document you're looking at? We didn't know anything about that. Oh, you got a spreadsheet open over here? Nobody mentioned that. So, ethnographic studies, empathetic studies, research basically boils down to the cycle of iterative ideation, prototyping, and testing. So, research, plan, ideate, prototype, and test. So, people will forget what you said and did, but not how you made them feel. It's a great quote by Maya Angelou. So tell me, how do your users feel when they're using your solutions?
Best.
Have you ever asked them? I mean, you hear about it when something's broken, right? After a new build, a new release, we all expect that. But do they enjoy using your system? Does it really improve things in their life, right? Like, does it make them more productive? Does it really help them? Or is it hindering them and they don't like using it? The next fundamental I'm going to cover is what we call the 5 planes of UX. The 5 planes build on each other from conception to completion. Our first plane is the strategy, where our efforts for both task and strategy. Well, same information. That's okay. Strategy, where our efforts are both task and information oriented. This is where we identify both the product objectives and the user needs with which we can proceed to the next plane, which is scope. Scope is where we clarify the task-oriented functional specifications. And by the way, the things I'm referring to, like product objective, user needs, functional specifications, those will be on the slide deck that you can download after today. Those were on the slide, part of that tweaking an hour before to add things you were only going to say. Anyway, okay, so scopes where we clarify the task-oriented functional requirements, functional specifications. These we're used to. We're used to getting the specs or an RFQ or something like that, where this is what they've asked for. So you're going to cover that when you're dealing with the scope. It's also going to be the point in time where you're dealing with information-oriented content requirements of the project. And with our project scope defined, we can now design the structure, which includes both the information architecture and the task-oriented interaction design. Those are the objects within our schema. Obviously, as soon as somebody starts to describe a problem, I start seeing graphs, relational graphs. I see layouts, I see scripts. I'm thinking of the how-to. That's my go-to. How do I fix this? I'm a problem solver. So that's where I go naturally. But what we need to do with design thinking is not do that yet. Don't think about how you're going to do it. At this stage, it doesn't matter how you're going to do it. What matters is, what are you trying to accomplish? What is the objective? What are you trying to build? And what is the experience that you're trying to deliver. And I don't mean like I'm trying to deliver an experience that looks like there are fairies flying around and Disney music is playing in the background, right? I'm talking about the functionality and the ease of use and the enjoyment level of the user. So then our next layer, next plane, you can call them planes or layers, planes. The next plane is the skeleton. And this is essentially the framework or mapping for how we intend to represent the information design, the interface design, and the navigation design. If you don't feel strongly about this yet, I urge you to change your mind about the need to define your navigation way up front. The navigation for your system is really the heart of how people are moving around and doing their job. So give that a lot of thought up front. Don't assume that the way you've always done it is the best way for the next project. And then finally, we have the surface layer. This is where we apply the visual and sensory design. So each plane is dependent upon and builds on the completed planes below it. But if we were to require work on each plane to be 100% finished before we could even start work on the next, we'd never get a project done. I don't know if that's would be your experience, but it certainly would be mine. So it's better to ensure that each stage is finished before the following stage can be finished, right? So you really can't say that your scope is finished if you haven't finished your strategy yet. And you can't finish your structure if you haven't finished your scope yet. But you can do them simultaneously in parallel. In fact, that's how most projects evolve. All right, Jean, take it.
So how many of you here are developers? That's what I assumed. So some of this might sound complicated. Here we're going to show you how you can get started and some of the techniques that we've used and have worked for us. So to summarize what Heather was saying, going through this process helps you understand your users, right? So to do that, you need to do the user research that we talked about. And then when you have the persona development, when you have the user research, helps you develop a persona. So the reason why we do this research, this user research, is because in most cases, like we discussed earlier, the customer is not the end user, right? So we want to understand as much as we can about the user, who they are, and what their role is, and how they interact with the solution or product that you're building, right? And when you have that, then you can actually create that persona. And Heather here will show you some of the fun personas that we've created for some of our projects. But to start with user research, what we're doing is we are trying to understand why people do things a certain way. We're trying to understand how people do their work, right? And in some cases, you want to know how many times do they do a certain task? When are they doing that task? Or how often do they have to repeat something? Or how often do they have to do those things? So as you can see, these lie into these two. One provides you a qualitative value and the other one gives you a quantitative value. So what you find is that the qualitative research will give you answers to the questions like why, how. So the answers you find will be based on opinions and feelings, right? And then on the other hand, you have quantitative research, which will give you answers in forms of numeric values. It will give you quantifiable information that you can use then to shape your decisions. And then, so you also find that the qualitative research will help you find what motivates people to do certain things. Help you identify their beliefs. Why do they believe that they have to do things a certain way? Also give you an idea of how, why they behave a certain way, or gives you also an opportunity to find solutions to some of the questions that, or some of the problems that they're facing. So the quantitative side will show you some trends. So maybe you see certain users at 9 o'clock, at 9 o'clock in the morning, they tend to do this thing. The coffee has not kicked in yet, so they're not as productive. Or it helps you identify issues and also give you some statistical data that you can use to make those decisions. So it gives you a relationship between cause and effect. So the qualitative value can help you develop a theory, and then the quantitative value can be the ability to test that theory. So to accomplish those, that's why we use those techniques like Heather was talking about. We do surveys, we do interviews, and we do observational studies like Heather was talking about ethnographics. I'll let her tell you about like the time she went to Zambia just to study a set of user groups and how that was able to influence her process.
So about 10 years ago, we had a client that ran a summer camp in Zambia for AIDS orphans primarily. And they had several hundred children who showed up every year over the course of a couple of months. And for every week of camp, it was a new group of kids and a new group of counselors, which were all Americans who would fly over there and serve for a couple weeks or a month or whatever. And they needed a system where they could match up the children that arrived to their group leader and take their picture. So we designed what we thought was a beautiful, efficient little system. It had to work on a really heavy duty laptop that had like those otter covers for your phones. This thing was in like a 3-inch thick. Apparently the dust is really bad in Zambia. So it had to be super protected. We made sure it worked. We came up with it. Just the coolest, quickest link to get those photos into the file as quickly as we could. And then the client said, I'd like to send Heather to Zambia. I never thought that FileMaker would send me to Zambia, but it did. And I really enjoyed it. But what I learned when I got there, they wanted me there on the first day of the first week of camp. Everything looked normal for what I would expect. Kind of the facilities were like a church that had been hollowed out, turned into like a basketball court kind of gymnasium, and then there were like classrooms along the side and a big grassy area with trees. Well, apparently the groups met under each tree. And I thought, well, our system's going to be great, where they're going to come, they're going to load the kids in, take their picture, everything's going to be wonderful. And then I heard them. I could hear them from probably a quarter mile away. The buses were coming down the dusty road, and the kids were hanging out the windows. Like you've seen those pictures of the buses in Mexico where people are like literally on top and they're so jam-packed. Well, there weren't any kids on top. That would be real hazard. But if a bus holds 50 kids, there were 75 in each bus. They were hanging out the windows and they were singing. And it was gleeful. I mean, I enjoy listening to singing. I've never heard anything like it. To be able to feel that emotion that they're experiencing, just hearing the way that they were singing, how excited they were. So the buses park, and and I kid you not, 90 seconds, 300 kids pour out and are in their groups. Like, I don't know how they knew where to go. And then they're ready to move on to the next task, the next activity. There's no time. These kids don't pre-exist in the system. And all there was time to do was take a picture, hopefully fill in some data later. Totally the flip side of how we would normally do something like that. We're going to capture a picture of someone, we're going to attach it to the person's record, right? That contact record, or that, camper record. No. So I spent my week in a dank little office in a building with no air conditioning, rewriting the whole thing, ground up, so that by the end of the week, they had something that would work for the following week. I never would have totally understood the environment, the urgency, just the atmosphere around them when they needed to use this system, if I hadn't seen it myself. So that's an observational study.
All right. So Hedana will also give us a few examples of the personas that we've developed for some of our projects. Some of them are really fun.
So, for example, one of the projects that we worked on, one of our primary personas was a character named Owen. And Owen is a program participant in this program that our client is the fiscal intermediary for. I say that 3 times fast. But as a result of our research, we discovered that there was not only a need for Owen, but also for Maxine and Soren and Helen and Evan and Carlos. All these different people in different roles and different reasons for being in those roles needed to interact with our system. They all needed to interact with the same web portal for different reasons. And we had to take them all into account, all of their needs, all of their priorities. And here's just a brief example of the resulting persona for Carlos. So Carlos obviously is a made-up person, but his role and some little bit of information about him, it helps with a couple of different things. It helps with the developers to know who they're building something for, to help understand why they're building what they're building. Why does this person need to use the system? Now, I'm not showing that level of detail here because his bio is actually really, really long. Just took some snippets from it to share with you. But it's important to understand who we're building for, why we're building for them. And not only that, to know that we didn't leave someone out. If there is, he's a program participant, but his mom is part of the circle of support and her reason for logging into the portal is completely different than his reason. We need to take them all into account. So, why do we do user research? It's because you are not your user. And I cannot state this loudly enough, but you are not your user. You are. You're really not your user. And we need to step away from we're the developer, we're the expert, we're the one you came to for our expertise, and so we're going to tell you how this is going to work. A lot of time that's what we end up doing, and it's great because we are good at what we do, and we're great partners to have, but we are not the end user, and we can't make assumptions about what the end user is going to actually need. You may find that you've got an end user who only has 2 fingers on one hand, and that affects something that they do. I'm going to show you an example where, not in this presentation, in my presentation tomorrow on script triggers, I'm going to share an example where we use script triggers because the accounting department or the payroll department handles physical timesheets that come in. They scan them, but they also have the physical timesheet. So they are incredibly adept at right-hand keying to enter all the details for timesheets. They don't want to use a tab button because that would require them to move their hand from here to here and back. And that is disruptive because they're so fast. And they've got a piece of paper in their other hand. Now, could we say, here's a new business rule. Put the paper in a holder and look at it so you can use both hands. No, that's not as comfortable for the users. They're very adept. So we use script triggers to solve the problem and give them the environment and the experience that they were looking for. So my shorthand for the next fundamental is Yantu. That is, you are not the user. I'm going to say a little bit more about it. So we think we're giving the client what we need, but are we really, right? Have you ever been surprised to find that a user didn't know how to do something that you thought was obvious? Show of hands. So this is the result of what is known as the false consensus effect, okay, which refers to people's tendency to assume that others share their beliefs and will behave similarly in similar circumstances or in a given context. We tend to overestimate how many people share our choices, values, and judgments. So we perceive alternate responses as rare, even deviant. This, by the way, is just one of over 180 cognitive issues that will impact your work. Okay, any of which can impact your work. Several impact our work as developers and designers. Therefore, seriously, you are not the user. And of course, I love this little chart here, drawing what you think users do and what they actually do. There's very little overlap there. And for many of us who've been developers, especially those of us who've been doing this for a long time, we're really kind of set in our ways sometimes. This represents a real mindset shift. That you have to consciously think user first before the code. Doesn't mean you don't still get to do cool stuff with the code, because otherwise why would we do what we do, right? Okay. Just a little more emphasis. Okay, moving on. All right, I'm going to give it back to Jean here.
Right. So yeah, to emphasize what Heather was saying, the reason why we do all these things, we do the research, we do the personas, is they provide with us, whether with the designers or the developers, they provide an understanding of the users, right? So that gives us a guiding design decisions that will prioritize user needs, goals, and preferences. So in this case, you are able to put your preferences to the side, and then you know that there's someone else that you need to put first, right? So by incorporating personas into the design process, designers can create a user-centric and effective solution that resonates with their target audience. So what Heather was saying, so when you create a persona, you are able to make that user into a real person, right? And real person, real people, they have real problems. And in some cases, those may come, as in forms of impairments. And that's why we like to talk about usability and accessibility. And there have been a lot of principles written about how you can address that, but we'll be focusing on a few of them. And
I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment, and I apologize, but another really great use that we found for personas is training and documentation. We use our personas when we write documentation for the client, so they know this is how this person does this. This is how that person does it. We do it in training and onboarding to tell stories about the bigger picture of what's happening.
We've actually made movies about those personas.
Yes, we have. They're pretty cool.
So we talk about landmarks and content grouping, and as you can see on the screen, in most cases you've come across interfaces that look the same as what you can see there. In most cases, you find your navigation on the left, you have your banner information at the top, and then the main content is centered in the middle, and then you have the complementary information in the far right position, the other left. Sorry. So another thing for Maker, we have those header sections,
right,
and the footer sections, and then you have the main body. So those are put in place because people using like screen readers or people who have vision impairment, they can use the tab key to navigate through the page, or they can use the screen readers to skip from one section of the page to the next one without losing important information. The other thing that we like to call to attention is leveraging the way people are programmed to scan the pages. When you look at computers, so phones or devices that we use, in most cases, if it's an action-based page, it's going to be scanned in a Z pattern, what they call a Z pattern. So the Z pattern is you have in most cases, this is applicable for for web applications. You have the main action or the home action on the left, and then you go to the left for the call to action. And then the main action is centered in the middle. So the user is scanning the page going this way, and all the actions are positioned in a strategic position so that the user can catch those main actions that we want them to do. And then
I was just gonna say, and for those who may recognize that this is a stock FileMaker image, we weren't being lazy by using it. It just happened to include all parts that we wanted to emphasize here.
Yep. And then I was gonna say about the F pattern. So like if you have a page that's text heavy, in most cases the users will scan the page going from left to right, and then go down and then repeat the same process, right? So when if you're taking advantage of this, then you're going to place those key information that you want people to take away from the page. Even if they don't read the whole thing, they can still get the main idea of what you're trying to tell them.
So for a non-web perspective, I would liken what Jean has described to what we often refer to as chunking of the information on our screen. So focus, obviously navigation needs to be consistent. If you have navigation to home in the upper left corner, it really better be there from everywhere. If you also have record navigation on the right in your header, then that's where it should be everywhere. So there's consistency across your solution. But not only that, on any particular layout or view, the primary action should be in focus. And the user shouldn't ever have to look for the data that they're looking for. It should be clear that, a name and address is here and the list of phone numbers are together over here. It should be clear rather than your phone numbers are buried in a value list that you can pull up when you select from within the address area, right? Just one example. So make it easy for your users to find what they're looking for. So the next fundamental that I want to cover is VIM, which stands for Visual, Intellectual, Memory, and Motor. These account for 80% of usability issues. Uh-oh. Oops. Oh, I'm not sure. I bumped something. Here we go. Oh, shoot. Okay. So they account for 80% of usability issues. So reducing them should be a very high priority for you. The first is visual load. This means reducing needless inconsistency and clutter, which will facilitate the user's ability to access the information and the functionality that they need. Next is intellectual load. You want to reduce the complexity. Remember, simple is better, no matter how cool it is. And by simple, I mean simple for the user, which probably means more work for you. Did you know that the average person makes over 35,000 decisions a day? I mean, if I had to guess, it wouldn't have been that high. So we don't want to add anything unnecessary to the user's already busy day. Next is memory load, short and long term. So where possible, reduce the need for required mental information storage, right? Whoever at Apple came up with the idea that when someone texts you a code and you're in the place where you're supposed to enter it, that a little thing shows up and says, enter the code. I hope they got a really big raise, like huge, massive. So not having to recall. And I mean, I myself have the short-term memory of a gnat, so I can totally relate. Common workflows, for example, are more easily remembered. But don't assume that your users will remember the details or the requirements for less frequent tasks. So like say reversing a deposit or generating end-of-year report, something they only do once a year. So make sure you take advantage of your things like tooltips, or add a help popover or a help card that they can open that, gives them a little documentation and reminds them about how they're going to do what they do or where they're going to access something. Also, and this is very important, don't use ambiguous icons. They force the user to think they have to think in order to distinguish what they mean. So unless you have a fixed set of corporate icons that are already being used, choose iconography that's consistent with the rest of the world. it might be cool to make up some of your own. And sometimes that's appropriate, but unless it's real obvious to the user, they understand that that's going to be a stumbling block for your users. And remember that when working with your app, as essential and wonderful as it may be, it's only one among a plethora of things that your users are likely to interact with each day. So don't make it something that they dread or that, they trip over. And last is motor load. So you want to reduce inconsistencies in required behavior. Example, and this is a physical example, a push-pull handle on a glass door that actually only works in one direction, but has no indication of which direction that is. Or how many of you have been to a museum and seen a bathroom door with no indication of which side you actually push to open the door? Okay, affordances are important. Okay. And the rule of thumb for UX is, of course, the more options there are, the more problems there can be. And it's our job to solve them. For accessibility in FileMaker, I don't know how many of you are aware of how to add accessibility tips. Great. Okay. So in this view, I have a field selected in the upper right corner. You can see that, but I have a field selected. And so from my menu, I pull down to, I can't see it there, but it's the inspectors. And then there's an accessibility inspector. When you pull that up, it allows you to specify a label and even help text. So someone who is using a screen reader to use your system, just like on a website, they can read your layout. And tab order is also important when you're dealing with accessibility. Of course, a situation where this is required for your app is something that your client really needs to make you aware of in advance. But I will always also caution you that there are laws that say anything that's paid for by the government of the United States must meet the accessibility requirements. And in the backup documents that we'll be posting online after the session, we'll have some references to those. Feel free to wade through them at your own leisure. But it's important to understand that these things can be added. Another tip, if you add a field to a layout and you use the label that's automatically added for you, if you choose that option, that will become the label that the screen reader will see. But we often use buttons for labels because we can do so much with them. So we use button bars and buttons, and of course the screen doesn't read those. So you have to select the object, the button on the button bar, and add an accessibility tip to it. And then the screen readers can read it for the users. So now we're going to move on to the real reason that you chose to attend this session.
All right. So really what we're trying to do when we go through all this process, we're trying to get the customer involved throughout the journey. And doing this, it demonstrates to them the commitment you have to actually meeting their requirements. When you're doing all this, you increase the likelihood for the customer to approve to whatever you're proposing to them. So in most cases, when you don't do this right, the customer will say, oh, this is expensive. Or there's someone who can do this for this, or, there's subjective preferences. I don't like this. I don't like that color, So those kind of things, you're able to avoid this by involving the customer throughout the process. That way, what you're presenting to them is backed by research, and this is the research that they have collaborated to. So they are less likely to say, oh, this is not what I was expecting, because they already know why you made those decisions. So we do that by by aligning those stakeholder expectations to the user needs, right? So we do that, and then we know that they understand that what they're asking has also to be in line with what the user will have to do that day-to-day job. It also helps us leverage competitor insights to give them an advantage. Because in some cases, we have off-the-shelf software that claims to do what the customer is asking for, right? But in most cases,
You mean like the tire company?
exactly.
Right?
So we are not an out-of-the-box company, so we will we won't be able to use an out-of-the-box software. So we're able to customize the software to whatever the customer actually or the user actually will be able to use. And this will also help us shape decisions with iterative feedback by incorporating the user feedback and also incorporating some of the customer feedback. This will also allow us to know like when we can push back or when we can, be accommodating to some of the customer requirements. And this will also, going ahead of the the slides because we're running out of time, but we promise that all this will be shared in the slides that we'll be able to download. So this allows us to be transparent with the customers because they are able to collaborate throughout the process. So they have a say in what ends up in the final product, and we're able to explain why that's the direction that we're taking. So we also talk about the MVP. In most cases, people use this as minimal viable product, but in this case, we'll be talking about minimal value product, and Heather will be explaining about
So the next fundamental that I'm showing, and I'm not going to go into this, but this is what's known as the UX hierarchy of needs. And it's the aspirational goal that we would deliver every solution to meet all of these user needs. Okay. Now, in a perfect world, with perfect clients, endless budgets, and uninterrupted days on end, we would always achieve our goals, wouldn't we? And deliver the entire hierarchy with every single project. Heck, I might even throw a bow on top. But if you're out here in the real world, like me, your best intentions and efforts can be easily thwarted by the tyranny of the urgent. So I'd like to take a brief moment to discuss the very important topic of how we prioritize and deliver on these needs. More likely than not, you found yourself in the situation like the following, where the functionality itself was so critical, so irritating, say that out loud, and the need so immediate that you delivered it in phases, beginning with the most essential, then improving on the solution until you eventually met your original goals. And that's assuming that so much time hadn't passed that the goals changed, right? Okay. I assume you're all familiar with the term MVP, minimally viable product. This is all about minimum value product, as in what's the minimum value that you're willing to deliver with your name on it, okay? That meets the entire hierarchy of needs. If you do that, you think of it that way, you're likely to deliver smaller increments of functionality at a time. Release and builds that are every month, every 2 weeks, whatever is appropriate. But each build is a small slice that meets all the needs for the functionality in that build. If you shift your mindset to think in terms of minimum value product, you'll be able to deliver higher value to your users and with greater frequency. But how you decide to deliver and when is part of the next topic.
Yep, have to define the scope. So to go along with what Heather was saying, the customer wants everything at once, right? So they want it, they want everything, they want it yesterday, and they want it cheap, right? So what we do is try to find the balance between what's possible in the real world and what is, like we're talking about, like the minimum value product, right? So you want it to be either fast and good, but it won't be cheap, right? So you need a lot of resources to be able to accomplish that. Or you want it to be good and cheap, but it won't be fast, right? Time is money, so do the math. And if you want all of that, if you want it to be fast, you want it to be good, and you want it to be cheap, that's an impossible utopia, right? So the way we define the minimal value product scope is we go by the effort by the organization, by you, the developers, and then how much value does that provide to the users. So if it's less value, but it's high effort, then that's a no-brainer, right? So you can pretty much throw that out of the window. But if it provides so much value to the user, and it requires very little effort, then that's your number one. And then the other ones could be those incremental steps that you can add to that product.
Future builds. Right.
So
I skipped over the successful delivery slide for this section just because we're running low on time here, but
right. So
talk about the silos.
So in most cases, you find companies where the salesperson will go to the customer, they paint them this perfect picture, and then they come back and say, hey, this customer wants our help delivering this, right? But they don't give the designers or the other teams the exact needs of the customer. So what the silos we're talking about here is when each team is operating independently, where there is no communication in between. So the key here is to break down those silos, and we do have a fun animation with the silos at our booth.
Yes. So visit our booth on the third floor for that.
Yeah. So the key here is to break down those silos so that the teams can collaborate with each other. So in this section, that's where we wanted to talk about when to involve developers. We need to have those meetings where developers can have an idea of what's going on throughout the project. So what we like to do is we have these types of screens where we can create these type of documentations where we can tell the developers, this is what the user is expecting to see, and this is what will happen if they tap this button, and this is all the steps that they have to go through to accomplish this goal. So having this level of documentation gives the developer an idea of what's expected and kind of combines. So it gives both the designer, the customer, and the developers a unique, the same idea of what success looks like.
And it may not be obvious, but these are not in FileMaker. And I don't know how many of you, like me, have built prototypes in FileMaker. Anyone? Okay. Building a prototype in FileMaker requires schema. That takes time and thought. That's not about the design. That's not about the end goal. So we encourage you to use other methods and other tools to wireframe and build prototypes of your systems before developing in FileMaker.
So here's an example of one of the tools that we use. This is Figma. Who is familiar with Figma? All right. I like to recruit for Figma. So this is one of the prototypes we created for a customer. So as you can see, everything is interactive. You can show the intended actions of each interaction with the system without writing a single line of code. So we're able to present this to the customer. We took it to the actual users who will be using the team, and we're able to get some variable insight that we actually leveraged throughout the development of this whole process. So you can have something like this without writing a single line of code, and then get that feedback that you need to make sure that the product will be successful to accomplish what we need from or what the customer is trying to accomplish.
And if you're not, looks like we have a duplicate here, so we'll move on. If you're not familiar with Figma, or you're not really into using like design and drawing tools, keep this in mind. First of all, you can't walk in another person's shoes till you take your own shoes off first, right? Remember, you're not the user. I'm going to skip this one right now just because of our timing. Head to here because all the other topics we would have loved to have discussed and we'd be happy to discuss with you later if any of you want to join us, is wireframing. And if any of you think that your clients won't be impressed by sketches, I'd like to argue that it's been my experience that not only don't clients have a problem with sketches, but they're actually more likely to point out issues and changes. They have, it's one of those cognitive biases. Basically, when I call it the prototype bias. If something is higher quality, they are less likely to call out an issue or a concern. And the reason for that is because they think that they spent money on that. And they don't want you to have to change it. That's going to cost them more money. But if you show them a sketch or something that really looks like a sketch, then they're not going to have that problem. They will point out everything that's wrong and they'll have ideas, and that's all good. So this is an actual example. I literally went into the client's conference room with my pad of vellum and laid out all of the different wireframes for each step of the workflow, and everyone at the table got a chance to look at it, feel it, touch it, and they had some great ideas. And that evolved into the digital wireframe with instructions. This was actually a system that was being redesigned, and we were able to do this and come up with the instructions for our developers. You know, this section moves over here, this comes down here, you're going to add this, and ultimately the style guide that our developers used for the redesign.
And so to go along with that, it's the customers will benefit from having providing that feedback in the design process rather than in the development process, because once you start writing code, then it's more expensive to make those changes that the customer might want. But if you show them low resolution wireframes or even give them like those prototypes, it takes less time to change those than to change it where you've already written a lot of code.
This is just another example of a sketched workflow. I mean, obviously it's just sketched with I did use templates, but it's just sketched to give the customer the idea of what the workflow is going to be. And then from that, after they approved and made changes, we did wireframes. And then the wireframe and the mock-up became a prototype that was interactive. And all of this was before building anything or writing any code. So when we wrote the code, we knew what we were trying to do and how it was supposed to work. This is another example of an interactive wireframe, interactive mock-up. This is what we would call low fidelity. High fidelity would be the full color version of your prototype. And all of now, the example that Jean showed was done in Figma. These were done in XD. Last, I like to use old school tools because I pull out, I don't go anywhere without a dot pad or a graph pad, and usually some templates, color pens, etc. Very old school. And I love Rocketbook, but there are other tools that we also use or have used. And there are also there's a library of books that I've read or intend to read in my own personal UX library. And of these, and that these obviously will all be in the slide deck for you afterwards, but the three that I recommend the most for starters are the Interviewing Users. It's a short book, it's an easy read, it's well written, and mine is full of little tabbies of the highlights. And I've given that to two other people on my team, and all they did was read the pages with the tabbies, and the user interviews that they did afterwards were so much better, much higher quality. So I highly recommend that. The next is Think Like a UX Researcher. and Designing for Emotion. It's another short book, easy read, and I am overwhelmed by how someone got all that great information into so few pages and made it easy to read. So I highly recommend those three. We intend to have more available on our website. So drop by our booth and grab a card, follow up later. And of course, we'll have an updated copy of the deck with the speaker notes that go with the slides you didn't get to see because we sped through them. Thank you.
Thank you.